Velanth noticed this first before the photographic translation matrices had even finished cycling, before the diplomatic seals were cross-checked against the 17-point authentication protocol, before any of that procedural theater had concluded. The smell reached her olfactory nodes through the hermetic filters of the Sovethian Accords negotiation chamber, faint and chemical and oddly warm, like something burnt slowly rather than quickly. She'd catalogued thousands of species' biological signatures over her 40-cycle career in the Hegemony's diplomatic auxiliary, and none of them smelled quite like this, like old fear dried into something that had learned to sit very, very still. The human delegation sat across the arc table. 4 of them, 2 women, 2 men, though she'd been briefed thoroughly enough to understand that this binary categorization was already a simplification the humans themselves were beginning to complicate. They wore dark suits fabric, still, cloth woven from plant fibers, almost touchingly primitive, and their hands rested flat on the table's surface, not gripping, flat, like they were pressing something down underneath. Ambassador Dara Nwosu led them. She was perhaps 50 of their years, Velanth estimated, though humans aged with such spectacular inconsistency that she'd stopped trusting her own assessments. There was gray at Nwosu's temples that had not been there in the pre-negotiation holographics from 8 of their months ago. The war had deposited it there, presumably. Stress calcified into color. Velanth found this fascinating and said nothing. The war had lasted well. Calling it a war felt generous to the humans. More accurate to say, the Sovethian hegemony had arrived, assessed Earth as a resource-viable biosphere with a mid-complexity sapient population, issued the standard displacement protocol, and then experienced an outcome that had not previously occurred in 1400 years of hegemony expansion. The humans had not surrendered. They had not fled or fractured into competing factions willing to negotiate separately. They had not even done what several other species at their technological level had done, which was launch a dramatic final offensive and then capitulate gracefully when it failed. They had made it expensive, grotesquely, incomprehensibly expensive. Not in terms that threatened the hegemony's ultimate dominance. No, that had never truly been in question, but in terms that made the hegemony's strategic council look, for the first time in recorded Sovethian history, like it had badly miscalculated something. The council did not enjoy this feeling. It had brought them to this table. "Shall we begin?" Nwosu said. Her voice was low and she did not frame it as a question. Not really, even though the words technically were one. Velanth's secondary adjutant, a young analyst named Koharis, who had never been deployed on a contact mission before this one, leaned slightly toward her. "Ambassador," Koharis murmured through the translation membrane. Their posture reads as submissive, hands visible, torsos exposed, standard subordination display. Velanth did not answer him. She was watching Nwosu's eyes. The treaty itself was 47 pages in its human language rendering, 6 in the Sovethian formulation, which was typical. Humans used an extraordinary quantity of words to say moderately simple things. The core terms weren't complicated. The hegemony would suspend the displacement protocol for a period of 200 of Earth's years, granting humanity time to advance technologically to a tier that would qualify them for protectorate status rather than resettlement. In exchange, humanity would open specific resource extraction corridors in 3 uninhabited regions of their oceans, would provide biological data sufficient for full species cataloging, and this was the part that had taken the longest to negotiate. The part that had made Velanth's superiors extraordinarily uncomfortable receive a formal apology. The apology was Nwosu's doing. She'd requested it in the 43rd session, calmly, without raising her voice as though she were asking for a glass of water. The hegemony's lead negotiator at the time, a veteran diplomat named Sovethian, had actually laughed. Not cruelly, he claimed afterward, just startled. The idea that a species the hegemony was actively in the process of displacing would request an apology, as though they were haggling at a market over the price of something already half sold, had simply struck him as bizarre. "You have destroyed 4 of our cities," Nwosu had said, still calm. "You have killed approximately 312,000 people. You have contaminated 2 river systems and collapsed what we called the Indo-Pacific Fishing Corridor, which means food insecurity for roughly 1 billion humans who did nothing to you. We want an apology. We are offering you 200 years of continued existence on your planet," Sovethian had replied. "Yes, and we want an apology too." A pause. These aren't mutually exclusive. It had taken 11 more sessions, but the apology was in the treaty. Page 9, paragraph 4, rendered in both Sovethian formal script and English with a translation in Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Hindi, French, Swahili, and Portuguese, because Nwosu had specified languages representing a combined population threshold. Vaillant had read it several times. It was, as apologies went, technically accurate and completely hollow, the kind of language that fulfilled a contractual definition without containing a molecule of actual remorse. The hegemony had no framework for remorse as humans understood it. They had regret, certainly, the pragmatic acknowledgement that an outcome had been suboptimal, but the specific alchemy of guilt, plus accountability, plus the desire for repair, that particular cocktail didn't really exist in Sovethian culture, which Vaillant thought. Watching Nwosu arrange her copy of the treaty in front of her with small, precise movements the humans certainly. The signing itself took 40 minutes. Lots of signatures. Humans were very attached to their individual identifications, their names, each person leaving a unique ink mark on paper, as though the universe might otherwise fail to distinguish them from one another. Vaillant observed the process with the disciplined patience she'd cultivated over decades, noting how each of the human delegates held their writing instruments, too tightly, knuckles briefly paling, one with elaborate looseness, the effect of someone performing calm, and Nwosu herself with the casual grip of a person signing a grocery receipt rather than a document that ended a war. When it was done, Nwosu looked up, not at Vaillant, at the room, at its walls, at the hegemony's insignia etched into the chamber's far panel. A long look, slow and measuring. Then she smiled. It was, Vaillant would later write in her incident report, a difficult smile to classify. The hegemony's xenopsychology division had developed 14 categories of human facial expression related to what they called the smile phenomenon, ranging from submission signaling to threat display. This one didn't fit cleanly into any of them. It was too quiet for satisfaction, too still for relief, and there was something in the set of Nwosu's jaw beneath it. Something compact and privately held that made Vaillant's secondary sensory nodes prickle with an alert she couldn't immediately name. "Thank you," Nwosu said, in Sovethian. It was the first time any human had spoken Sovethian in the negotiation chamber. The pronunciation was imperfect but comprehensible, and Coharis went so still beside Vaillant that she could hear his ventilation slow. "When did she learn to do that?" he whispered. Vaillant was already writing a note to herself. The post-signing reception, a human custom the hegemony had reluctantly accommodated, was held in the chamber's adjacent hall, a space that had been quickly and somewhat awkwardly decorated with flowers. Real ones, brought up by shuttle, earth flowers, white and yellow, and one aggressively orange variety that several hegemony officials seemed to find alarming. The smell of them mixed badly with the recycled air of the ship's environmental system and produced something that reminded Vaillant, strangely, of the treaty document. That same warm, burnt quality. She'd positioned herself near the hall's far wall, old habit, always know your egress, and was conducting the calculated performance of studying a data tablet while actually watching the room. The human delegation had spread out, which struck her as unusual. Most subordinate treaty signatories clustered together in unfamiliar environments, an instinctive herding behavior. The humans had done the opposite. They dispersed into the hegemony contingent like water into soil. One of the human men, Thomas Bryce, she recalled, deputy director of something called the Emergency Diplomatic Corps, a position that had apparently been created specifically for this negotiation, was talking to 3 hegemony logistics officers. Actually talking to them, not just exchanging polite noises. Vaillant tilted her reception nodes and caught fragments. He was asking about the hegemony's propulsion systems. Not strategically. Not in a way that set off any protocols, just with the bubbling, unself-conscious curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know. The logistics officers, clearly not trained for this, were answering him, actually telling him things. She made another note. The second woman in the delegation, Dr. Petra Vasquez, listed as Chief Science Liaison. A title Vaillant suspected had also been recently invented, was with a group of hegemony xenobiologists. They'd found a corner and produced what appeared to be actual paper drawings. Vasquez was sketching something quickly, sliding it across to the nearest xenobiologist, who studied it with an expression Vaillant recognized as genuine interest rather than diplomatic performance. And Nwosu herself was speaking quietly with Sovethian, who had returned for the signing ceremony despite being replaced as lead negotiator halfway through the process. Old professional courtesy, Vaillant had assumed. Now she wasn't sure. Sovethian was nodding at intervals, And once, just once, he laughed. A real one, not the startled bark from session 43. Something Nwosu had said had actually amused him. That was when Valiant's unease crystallized into something with more defined edges. She'd sat through enough treaty signings to know what they usually looked like on the side of the party that had effectively lost. Rigid dignity, careful restraint, the particular emotional discipline of people who were grieving but had been told the grieving had to happen privately, later, after all the witnesses were gone. She'd seen it on 9 different species. She knew what it looked like. It did not look like this. Mal. Velanant put down her data tablet and walked across the room to where Nwosu and Soverath stood. They noticed her approach. Of course they did. She wasn't being subtle. Ambassador Nwosu, she said, in the Hegemony's standard trade speech, which the human delegates all used. I wanted to offer my own informal regards. The process was long. 54 sessions. Nwosu agreed. 18 months, my hair went gray. She touched her temple with a forefinger. Briefly, the gesture so quick it might have been unconscious. Worth it, I think. You believe the terms are satisfactory. I believe the terms are what they are. There was a precision to that non-answer that Velanant felt like a small stone dropped into still water. The apology was important to you. Nose considered this, not for long, maybe 2 seconds, but with a quality of consideration that felt genuine rather than strategic. Accountability matters, she said finally. Naming what happened mattered. Even in here she paused again. A fraction of a pause. Just enough to notice even when the naming is the point, rather than the feeling behind it. Velanth held very still. Even when the naming is the point. She thought about that, thought about it later, lying in her sleeping alcove while the Sovethian Accord maintained geosynchronous orbit over the gray-blue sphere of Earth. Thought about it the way you think about something you suspect is important but haven't yet decided how. The apology she'd written off as an emotional demand. A grief response dressed as a diplomatic term. Humans, the briefings had consistently said, were emotionally reactive, prone to symbolic gestures, attached to ritual in ways that sometimes overrode pragmatic interests. Asking for an apology from a species that had partially destroyed their civilization seemed to confirm this. Irrational, grieving, grasping at forms of redress that couldn't undo the actual damage. But Nwosu hadn't said the apology mattered, because of what it meant to human feelings. She'd said the naming was the point. Velamant sat up in the dark. Her secondary nodes were running calculations she hadn't consciously asked them to start. Old defensive instinct sometimes. The body understood before the mind caught up. She pulled up the treaty text on her reader and went to page 9, paragraph 4, and read the apology again. It was in Sovethian formal language, a complete and binding acknowledgement. The hegemony formally recognized using the specific Sovethian legal vocabulary for recognition, which carried weight in hegemony law the way that no vaguer construction would that its forces had caused harm to the sapient population of Earth during the period of the displacement protocol. That this harm had been inflicted. That it was harm. In Sovethian legal framework, that kind of formal recognition created what was called a veleth, a recorded obligation, not punishable, not enforceable in any current practical sense, but permanent, archived, part of the hegemony's legal record for as long as the record existed. Velanth's mouth went dry. The hegemony had signed an apology. Yes, hollow, formal, contractually precise without an ounce of real remorse, but in doing so, in using the correct Sovethian legal language because their own translation team had drafted the thing and of course they'd used their own conventions, they had created a veleth, a formal, archived, legally recognized acknowledgement that the displacement protocol had caused harm to Earth's sapient population. The kind of acknowledgement that, in 200 years, when humanity had advanced to protectorate status and gained access to hegemony legal institution, she stopped the thought, restarted it. In 200 years, when humanity gained standing to bring cases before the hegemony's adjudication councils, the veleth would already be there, waiting, signed by hegemony representatives, entered into the permanent record. Velanth got up. It was ship night, the corridors running on low illumination, and she walked them quickly, heading toward the communication suite. She needed to reach the hegemony's legal division immediately. She stopped, because she was already doing the next calculation, the one that followed naturally, and it was this. The human delegation had included, listed as secondary advisor and barely mentioned in the briefing notes, a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, who had spent 18 years specializing in hegemony law. Before the war, before first contact, she'd spent nearly 2 decades studying the legal frameworks of a civilization humanity hadn't officially known existed. Velananth stood in the dim corridor and breathed. The humans hadn't been studying hegemony law in anticipation of this war. They'd been studying it before, as if they'd expected not this war specifically, perhaps, but something like it. As if some of them had looked at the universe's size and made a reasonable inference about what might eventually arrive from it, and had begun, quietly, doing their homework. She thought of Nwosu's smile, that still, compact, privately held thing. She thought of Bryce asking the logistics officers about propulsion, open and curious, charming them into talking. She thought of Vasquez sketching for the xenobiologists. Building rapport, yes, but also Velananth now suspected. Cataloging how hegemony scientists thought, what they found interesting, what they responded to. She thought of the war, 18 months of it. Humans fighting with weapons a century behind hegemony technology. And somehow making it expensive enough that the hegemony sat down and signed a document that, buried on page 9, contained a legal mechanism humans could use in 200 years to demand restitution for every city, every contaminated river, every collapsed fishery. Not despite losing, because of how they'd chosen to lose. Velananth resumed walking. Her steps were faster now. Behind her, somewhere in the ship, the humans were presumably sleeping, or perhaps they weren't. Perhaps they were also awake in the ship night, having their own quiet thoughts, and she found that she could not decide whether this possibility frightened her or filled her with something that felt uncomfortably and unexpectedly like admiration. She reached the communications suite, and the duty officer looked up, startled by her hour. "Get me the legal division," Velananth said. "Priority tier, and pull every file we have on Dr. Amara Osei. Is there a pine of their agessen woepermengt? I was monkein forsen of facial of ufsadadol flied would final pulled tours, mouthing very came fine. I was mon or pulled tours." "Now," she said. Then, because she was nothing if not thorough, also pull the briefing files on the rest of them, all 4 delegates. Everything. I want the employment histories, the academic specializations, what they studied before the war, what they published, who they corresponded with. She paused. "And I want the full text of every hegemony legal document Dr. Osei has ever cited in her published work." The duty officer began pulling files with the efficient panic of someone who understood urgency without understanding context. Velananth pulled up a chair and sat down to learn, quite possibly, just how thoroughly she'd underestimated the species currently sleeping 2 corridors away, or not sleeping. She wouldn't put money on it either way. No way. Velananth read them in the communication suite with a cold beverage she'd stopped tasting 40 minutes in. Her secondary nodes running parallel analysis while her primary consciousness moved through the documents like someone walking slowly through a house where they'd begun to suspect the architecture was different than the walls suggested.
Osei had published 9 monographs on hegemony legal precedent. 9. The first one, she'd published 8 years before first contact, 8 years before humanity had any official acknowledgement that the Sovethian hegemony existed. She'd framed it as speculative legal theory, as a thought experiment about hypothetical interstellar governance structures, the kind of thing that got published in academic journals with very small readerships, and earned its author a reputation as either visionary or eccentric, depending on which of her colleagues you asked.
The 9th monograph had come out 4 months before the displacement protocol began. Velananth read its concluding chapter twice. It was in retrospect she acknowledged the retrospect part. She had to. It was only fair, a fairly precise roadmap for how a less technologically advanced civilization might use formal treaty mechanisms to establish legal standing with a more powerful one, which sections to insist upon, which vocabulary to demand, which precedents created obligations that would outlast the political context that generated them. It was also, she noticed, dedicated simply to MN2 initials. She checked the dates. Osei had defended her doctoral dissertation the same year that a young Foreign Service officer named Dara Nwosu had begun her career in what was then called the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. That office, Velananth now remembered, had been defunded and reorganized 3 times before the war, but had never quite died. Someone had kept it alive through 3 rounds of budget cuts and 2 changes of administration and what one document described as persistent institutional skepticism. The file didn't say who, but it named Nwosu twice in footnotes dated to the period of each threatened defunding. Velananth set down the cold beverage. She looked at the wall. She thought, they built this. They built it over decades. Some of them, The ones who looked at the sky and did math and arrived at conclusions that most of their civilization wasn't ready to hear. They kept a legal research program running inside an academic framework so it wouldn't be visible. They kept a diplomatic infrastructure alive through budget cycles. They didn't know when, they didn't know how bad, but they built the architecture of response and planted people inside it, and then when the hegemony arrived, they were ready in ways the hegemony's intelligence division hadn't recognized as readiness because it didn't look like anything the hegemony had ever seen. Coher is knocked and entered, looking as though he hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. "Ambassador?" he said. He had the slightly hollow look of someone who'd also been reading things and had arrived somewhere uncomfortable. "I have been reviewing the secondary briefing files on Bryce." "Tell me." "He's an engineer. Before the Emergency Diplomatic Corps, which you were right was created specifically for this, it has existed for 14 months. He spent 20 years at something called CERN." Coher hesitated. "It's a research institution, particle physics, primarily." His specialty was another hesitation. His specialty was theoretical propulsion frameworks. Based on models, he published papers suggesting he'd developed from what he called available extraterrestrial data. Velavant stared at him. Pamenprotmol, the more called Wolv. "The hegemony's propulsion signatures," she said slowly. "When our survey ships were doing the resource assessment, before contact, our ships were detectable," Coher eyes confirmed, with the expression of someone delivering news they'd rather not be delivering. "To sufficiently sensitive instruments, and apparently Bryce built those instruments 20 years ago. He'd spent 20 years reverse engineering hegemony propulsion theory from the electromagnetic signatures of ships doing what the hegemony had genuinely believed was undetected preliminary survey work. And last night he'd stood in the reception hall asking logistics officers about propulsion systems with that guileless, bubbling curiosity, and they'd answered him, and what did they tell him?" Velanth asked, very quietly. "I have pulled the surveillance audio." Korvax sat down without being invited to, which was a measure of how bad it was. They confirmed 3 technical details that would allow someone with Bryce's existing knowledge base to close several significant gaps in his models. "Silence." "Vasquez," Velamont said. "Xenobiologist. Completed 2 doctorates. Her second one," he glanced at his tablet, "was on comparative immune system architecture across theorized silicon-based and carbon-based sapient species. Published 11 years ago. She apparently developed the theoretical framework for hegemony immune systems from first principles before we'd made contact." "How accurate was she?" "About 83%, Korvax said. That's better than our own models for species we'd only done preliminary surveys on. We usually achieve 60 to 70. In the corridor outside, Velant heard footsteps. Light, unhurried, the pace of someone taking an early morning walk. She was almost certain it was one of the human delegates. She didn't get up to look. She sat with the strangeness of being on a ship that was hers, in a solar system her hegemony had come to take, listening to a human walk past and feeling for the first time in 40 cycles of diplomatic work like she might be the one who'd been outmaneuvered. Not in the war. She was clear-eyed about the war the hegemony had won it in every meaningful military sense. But winning a war and winning the engagement were different things, apparently. She'd read histories that suggested this. Histories of small civilizations that had lost wars and then, by playing longer games with shrewder hands, had ultimately redefined what the loss meant. She'd read them as curiosities, historical footnotes. The desperate ingenuity of the defeated. She hadn't applied it, practically, to anything that was happening to her. Right now, today. "The Veleth," she said. "I saw your alert to the legal division." Korvax nodded. "They are reviewing it. The preliminary assessment is—" He paused, and the pause had a quality that Velant recognized as someone choosing words carefully, complicated. "The language in the apology does appear to meet the threshold for formal recognition. Whether it constitutes a binding Veleth depends on several questions of precedent that have apparently never come up before, because no hegemony treaty has previously included language of this kind with a non-member species. Because no non-member species has ever asked for it. Yes." Velan thought of Nwosu's voice saying even when the naming is the point rather than the feeling behind it. She knew exactly what she was asking for, Velant, he said. Not a question. The legal division's assessment is that yes, in all likelihood, someone advising the human delegation was aware of the Veleth mechanism and specifically requested language that would trigger it. Someone advising the delegation. Dr. Amara Osei, 9 monographs. dedicated to two initials that matched the name of the woman who'd kept a nearly defunded diplomatic office alive through 3 budget crises, who'd spent 18 months negotiating with infinite patience, who'd asked for an apology in session 43, the way you'd ask for something you already knew you were going to get because you'd already decided how to get it. The Hegemony signed it anyway, Vaillanth said. Our own legal team drafted the language. They didn't catch it. They didn't know to look for it, Korvax said, not unkindly. It's not a mechanism that's ever been used in this context. It requires a very specific kind of legal knowledge and a very specific kind of patience, I think. To see it from this far in advance. Patience. Yes, that was the word, wasn't it? The thing the Hegemony kept miscalculating. Humanity's war-making had confused them because they'd expected creatures fighting for survival to make increasingly irrational decisions under pressure, to panic, to fracture, and instead the humans had done the opposite. They'd gotten quieter and more deliberate as the losses mounted. They'd made choices that didn't make immediate sense, and had turned out to be setups for choices that would make sense later. The Hegemony had looked at humanity's technology level and decided what they were capable of. The technology level had been the wrong variable. What does the legal division recommend? Vaillanth asked. They are still deliberating. Korvax set down his tablet. There's a faction arguing the apology was obtained through a form of misrepresentation, that the humans deliberately induced the Hegemony to create a Veleth without disclosing their understanding of what the language would accomplish. Can that argument be made to invalidate it? Possibly. But formally making it would require the Hegemony to argue, in its own legal framework, that it signed a document without understanding what the words it chose meant. He let that sit for a moment. The implications of it sat heavily. It would also require us to argue that the humans were obligated to explain Hegemony law to us, which is not our strongest position. Vaillanth agreed. A longer silence. Somewhere in the ship, the humans' unhurried footsteps had faded. She thought about what Sov-Harath had laughed at. In session 43. The absurdity of the request. The nerve of it, almost. A species the Hegemony was in the process of displacing, asking for an apology as if they had standing to demand anything. They did, though. Though. Admiral Fowes of Noman Laconth, Onul B. Hennerits for Warprolam. They'd always had standing not in the technical legal sense, not until now, but in the sense of being sapient creatures to whom things had been done. Creatures who had then looked at their situation with remarkable clarity and thought about it from every angle, and decided to play the long game. 200 years. That was the treaty term. 2 centuries for humanity to advance its technology to protectorate tier. 2 centuries. For the Veleth to sit in the Hegemony's legal record. 2 centuries for humanity to study Hegemony institutions, the way Osei had been studying them for a decade before the war, the way Bryce had been studying Hegemony physics, the way Vasquez had been working out what Hegemony biology looked like from first principles, just, quietly, learning. 200 years of learning and preparing and arriving, at the end of it, with legal standing and a documented acknowledgement of harm already in the record. Vaillanth thought about what humanity might look like in 200 years. She thought about what they'd already looked like when she'd underestimated them. She stood up. I need to speak with Ambassador Nwosu, she said. Korvax blinked. Now, it's early ship time. They may still be found upward so. She's awake, Vaillanth had said. She was sure of this, in the way you become sure of things when you have finally built an accurate model of someone. She was the one walking in the corridor 20 minutes ago. She's been awake, I think, most of the night. She left the communications suite and walked back through the low-lit corridors. The door to the human delegation's quarters was down a short passage that ended in a viewport showing Earth's dark light curve from above the planet slowly rotating beneath them. Cities visible as orange gold threads on the night side. Impossibly fragile from here. Impossibly bright. Nwosu was standing at the viewport. She turned when she heard Vaillanth's approach. She wasn't startled. She'd known the footsteps, probably, had anticipated this the way she seemed to have anticipated quite a lot of things. You have been doing some reading, Nwosu said. Quite a lot of it, Vaillanth confirmed. She stopped a few feet away, and for a moment they stood together looking at the planet. It was, Vaillanth admitted privately, beautiful in a way that satellite photography hadn't quite conveyed the living, breathing complexity of it. Weather systems swirling over the dark oceans, the Terminator line catching somewhere that might have been a mountain range, the whole improbable sphere of life and history and whatever made a species decide, when faced with an incomprehensibly more powerful adversary, to play the longest game they could imagine, instead of simply despairing. The Velith, Velan said. Nwosu didn't say anything. Fine, Nwosu didn't say anything. It was intentional. I think you know that I know that now, so I'm not asking whether it was intentional. I'm asking. Velan paused. Found the question she actually wanted to ask. I'm asking why you told me. Last night. Even when the naming is the point. You didn't have to say that. Nwosu was quiet for a moment. The planet turned beneath them, slow and unhurried. Because you would have figured it out anyway, she said finally. You are good at your job. You would have read the files, done the math, gotten to the same place, but you might have gotten there angry or frightened, and I didn't. She stopped. I didn't want the hegemony's first real understanding of what we are to be routed through fear. I wanted it to start with something more accurate. And what are you? Velanath asked. The question came out quieter than she'd intended. Almost she wasn't sure how to characterize it. Genuine, maybe, just genuinely wanting to know. Nose looked at her. The ambassador's eyes were tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired in the deep tissue way of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and hadn't set it down yet, and wasn't entirely sure what would happen when they did. Stubborn, she said. Probably to a pathological degree if you ask my ex-husband. A small, almost laugh, gone quickly. We are very bad at accepting that a situation is permanent. It's one of our less rational traits, honestly. Most species, I think, when you have demonstrated sufficient superiority, they update their understanding of the situation. They accept the new hierarchy. She shook her head. And there was something in the gesture that was self-aware enough to be funny and too honest to be entirely funny. We just start planning for the scenario where the hierarchy changes. Even when there's no rational basis for expecting that. Especially then, maybe. She turned back to the viewport. 312,000 people, she said. And the sentence was so different from the one before it, dropped with such quiet weight, that it changed the quality of the air. I can name about 40 of them. People I knew. A city I'd visited. A coastline where She didn't finish that. The apology was in the treaty because naming what happened to them mattered. Because they deserved to have it on record that something was done to them, and that the entity that did it acknowledged it. Even if the smallest hesitation, even if the acknowledgement was more useful legally than it was emotionally. Velanth stood with that. She let it be complicated, which it was. In 200 years, she said slowly. If your civilization achieves protectorate tier, and I think you will, I'm updating my estimates significantly, you will have legal standing to bring claims before the Adjudication Council. With the Velith already in the record. Yes, the hegemony will contest it. Almost certainly, it could take a very long time. Decades. Cycles. The Council's docket is, we are patient, Nwosu said. And she said it so simply that Velan felt it land somewhere between a reassurance and the quietest possible threat she'd ever encountered. They stood at the viewport together for a while after that. Not talking. Earth turning beneath them, picking up morning along its eastern edges. Gold spreading across what might have been the Indian Ocean or the South Atlantic. Velanth couldn't tell from here. She hadn't yet learned the geography well enough, and she thought with something that surprised her by its sincerity that she should learn the geography. She should learn a great many things about this planet and its inhabitants, not as a threat assessment, not as a displacement protocol update, just because it seemed like important information, going forward, to have. She would write a report when she got back to her quarters. It would be thorough and unprecedented, and several of her superiors would find it extremely uncomfortable reading. She would recommend, formally, that the hegemony's legal division begin preparing for the possibility that in 200 years a species they had casually displaced would arrive before the Adjudication Council with better preparation than most hegemony member states, and with a document signed in the hegemony's own legal language that would make their case for them. She would also recommend, less formally, but perhaps more urgently, that any future first contact assessment include what she intended to call a patience variable, a metric for how long a civilization's planning horizon extended, how many generations back their preparatory thinking went, whether there was evidence of institutions maintained through adversity for reasons that didn't become clear until later. She thought this was the variable the hegemony had consistently missed, not weapons, not technology. The question of how far forward a species was willing to think. Humanity, apparently, quite far. Quite far indeed. Ambassador Nwosu, Velanth said, finally preparing to leave. Dara, Nwosu said. Velanth paused. My name, Nwosu clarified. I think we will be having a number of conversations over the next 200 years, one way or another. My name is Dara. Valath considered this. It was, she understood, an offering of a kind. Not trust. Exactly, trust was a long way off, earned over exactly the kind of time they were both contemplating. But a door left slightly open, the beginning of a posture that acknowledged they were, whatever else they were, going to have to learn each other. Vel and Ant, she said. Vel, if you prefer? Nwosu Dara nodded, and almost smiled again, that same compact private thing. But this time Velant was closer to understanding what was in it. Not triumph, not quite, something more worn and more real than triumph. Relief, perhaps. The specific relief of someone who has carried a long plan to its first completion and can let themselves briefly feel that the weight has shifted even if it hasn't disappeared. Vela Ant left her at the viewport and walked back through the low-lit ship. Her secondary nodes very quiet now, no longer running defensive calculations, just thinking, processing. The kind of slow, honest recalibration that her career had rarely required of her because the situation she'd encountered hadn't, before this, genuinely surprised her. Outside, the planet kept turning, dawn moving across it in a wave, patient and unstoppable, the way light always moved across things. It didn't rush, it didn't force, it simply kept going until the dark had nowhere left to be. She wondered, climbing back into the communication suite to begin her report, if the humans had picked that up from the universe itself. The patience, the long game, whether they'd looked at the physical laws of their world, at tides and erosion and the growth of things from seeds into forests over centuries, and had internalized, at some cellular level, the understanding that the most powerful forces weren't always the fastest ones. Probably she was being poetic. She was tired and it was early, and she was working on a shattered understanding of a species she'd thought she'd adequately briefed. Poetic was maybe forgivable under the circumstances. She began to write. The human delegates departed the Sovethian Accord at Aero 740 ship time, returning to their surface via their own shuttle, a small and battered craft that nonetheless made the atmospheric re-entry with practiced confidence. I observed from the observation deck. Ambassador Nwosu did not look up as the shuttle descended. She was, I suspect, already thinking about something else. I am recommending an immediate review of the treaty's legal provisions, with specific attention to the language of the apology on page 9. I am also recommending, and I want to be precise in my language here, because I intend this recommendation to be taken seriously, that the Hegemony's Strategic Council convene within the next cycle to comprehensively reassess our classification of human civilization. They are not what we thought they were. They were never what we thought they were. The error was ours, and it is documented now, in our own archive, in our own script, signed by our own representatives. They asked us to name what we'd done. Well off to name what we'd done. Dushin bull we have to be cordisis partic. Corvax's mall of pumpagis to be fablida bisum. We named it. Why? I don't think they will let us forget it. She stared at that last line for a moment, then left it in. It was accurate. It was also, she thought, the same point Nwosu had been making all along, quietly, with patience, across 54 sessions and 18 months and 200 years still ahead of them. Naming things mattered. Records lasted, and some species, it turned out, understood this better than civilizations that had been keeping records for 1400 years. She saved the document and sent it, and sat back, and looked at the ceiling of the communication suite, and thought for the first time in a long time, genuinely thought that she might have to revise not just a tactical assessment, but something closer to a worldview. Outside, Earth completed another quiet degree of its rotation. The morning moved on.